Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Quarks and Quarter Notes. Today we will be talking about consciousness, some of our views on what consciousness is and why we're conscious and why it matters. So, to start with the whole discussion, I guess, what is consciousness? Can you define it for me?
The way I think about consciousness is it's just what it's like to be something. Or something is conscious if it's something like to be that thing.
So, how do you get there? Because I mean, there are so many ways to talk about consciousness. For some people, it's just like perceptual awareness. It's a very vague word. We usually treat certain things like they're conscious and other things like they're not.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like you need to be aware of your consciousness to be conscious. The first person awareness that humans have, I don't think is a requirement for consciousness.
Okay, that's useful because some people would think of that as the only consciousness.
It's
So,
just awareness.
so you're just saying, like, so for you, consciousness is just the fact that something is happening.
Yeah.
So are you conscious?
Well, yes, and it's because I would say I'm conscious because it's something like to be me.
And you can be quite confident of that.
I'm more confident of it than literally anything else.
So how do you go about granting consciousness? So you would probably say that I'm conscious as well. How do you get there?
I think it would be just like the fact that I am, and I'm aware of that fact that I am conscious. I think it just you're not so different than me. We're sort of like the same sort of thing in the universe, a human, and it's just my view that humans are conscious.
So
The only thing that I truly know is that I am conscious.
right. So how confident are you that, like, say I'm conscious?
I'm fairly confident in it. Yeah.
Like, so you're maybe 100% sure that you're conscious, and then what
Like
percent would you put on everyone
very
else?
high, like very high.
So what
Well
makes it
above
so
90.
high? What makes it so high but not 100? Like, what's happening? How do you get
Well,
there?
I wouldn't ever say I try not to say 100% on anything. And so that's the reason it's not 100%.
Well, for consciousness, it's a little different though, right? Because just to say that something is happening, I don't know. When we say we're like 99% sure the Earth's rotating around the sun, or that we're not a brain in a vat, or something like that, like we can say those with high confidence, but not certain because we can logically conceive of other things, even if they're very unlikely. For consciousness, though, I'm not even sure how you can begin to be mistaken about the fact that something is happening.
Yeah, so at least for like the first person's perspective, like my consciousness is what I'm most sure about.
Right. But
Yeah.
are you saying you wouldn't put that at 100, or did I?
My own consciousness, yes, that's 100%.
Okay, so Renee
But as
just
far
said,
as
I think
somebody
therefore I
else,
am.
I'm not sure.
Is it like 99, like the Earth rotating around the sun, or is it more like
Yeah,
okay? Because
it's pretty high up there.
some people might think that some people might put it at a much lower probability, but for practicality's sake, behave as though everyone else is conscious, but in their
Yes.
inside they don't believe it.
I think it is useful, but I also think it's true.
Well, so what I'm trying to get at is how do you determine that something is conscious? So you're very confident that I'm conscious, and your only justification really is that I'm similar to you.
Well, that would be like my intuition. I would say you're conscious if it's something like to be you.
So are dogs conscious?
In my view, yes.
Because
It's
they're
definitely.
similar to you.
Well, it's because it's probably something, it feels like something to be a dog. That's
Right.
why a dog
Yeah,
is conscious.
but how do you know it's something to feel
I
like it to
don't.
be a dog?
Right.
But you're telling me you believe it's more likely than not that dogs are conscious. So how do you get to that proposition? Because for a long time people haven't believed that. So how do you get there?
Well, we can use like universal experiences, at least here on planet Earth. We have things like pain, which is a very common, and I know the feeling of pain just from my first person subjective awareness of it. And then I know that if I like poke an animal with a stick or something, they recoil from it or they act in such a way that seems familiar to me, like they move away from the pain. And it's just, I can only assume that what's going on inside their brain is some sort of like awareness of that pain. And
That's really interesting. So I mean, there's really no way to just not get into this hard problem of consciousness, but and we'll elaborate more thoroughly. But to stay on this line, so you're saying because you can poke like a dog with a stick and it's going to react and recoil, that's what makes you think it's conscious. When the Roomba, when you step in front of the Roomba and it like moves to avoid you so that it doesn't crash,
mhm.
is that, would you describe that as consciousness?
I'm not sure. Like, like, does it feel like something to be a Roomba?
Right.
That would
That's
be the question I would ask.
But well, so my point is you're getting to the dog being conscious because the dog clearly reacts to stimuli, um,
Hmm.
and will avoid certain things, particularly like being poked with a stick potentially. Um, but so will the Roomba. The Roomba will do the exact same thing. It's going to crash into something. It senses that it doesn't want to crash into it, so it diverts the path. So
Hmm.
why do you think a Roomba's conscious? Just like if, best guess, because
It's slippery slope, but like, yes, in a sense.
okay, so maybe we shouldn't go on that trail. Maybe we should wait to go on
Right.
that. Okay,
Right.
let's rewind then. Let's just start with the hard
Right.
problem. So David Chalmers, do you know David
Mm.
Chalmers, philosopher? He's actually the one who named the hard problem
Stated
of
the hard
consciousness.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is that?
The hard problem. Well, it's just the fact that consciousness seems to be subjective, whereas like the physical sciences appear to be completely objective. And it's how do you well I feel like we're encountering the hard problem right here in our conversation. It's just like how can we test for something else to be conscious?
Right. Because, like you said, you're 100% sure something's happening for you, but you can't be
Hmm.
100% sure something's happening for me. Well, we'll get into our own views on this question, but let's start with the traditional answer to this question. And neither you or I subscribe to this, but maybe we can try to steelman it.
Hmm.
So dualism. So it's the idea that mind and body are separate, and that's why we run into this problem. We have brains, we have bodies, and then there's also minds, and they're somewhere else. They're not in this natural world, and we can't see them. And that's why it seems, even though you can, for you, you can be very confident that something's happening for you, you can't be confident that something's happening with someone else simply because their mental capacity, their soul or mind or whatever you want to call it, is somewhere else,
Hmm.
and there's some sort of interaction going on there. So again, neither you or I subscribe to that, but how can we steelman this idea, which also comes from Descartes, by the way, the I think therefore I am
Hmm.
proposition that we sort of started with.
That's a hard one. Um,
It's certainly intuitive, right?
well, that definitely, yeah, it's intuitive to think that we have a mind or a body and a soul, or a body and a mind, which are separate. That makes sense.
Yeah, it feels like even though your body goes through all these changes and things get really different, there's a subjective sense that you're always there. You're there in the middle. There's like an unchanging locus of mind who's kind of sitting there watching all these changes happen throughout time.
Right. It just, I don't know how to. ideal minute, but I think just intuitively, like it would seem reasonable that we have a mind separate to our body, and like it just seems like a reasonable explanation for what's going on, or at least a good first guess.
So the answer to why can't we be sure whether other things are conscious, or why anything is conscious, is simply that the things that are actually conscious aren't here. So
Right.
so truly nothing is conscious in the physical world, and everything that's conscious is somewhere else, and that's why we
Hmm.
get this
It's in that
phenomenon.
mental world. Yeah. But the problem with dualism is, well, dualism has a lot of problems, I think. But
First, we can get into the problems, but first I want to use this notion of philosophical zombies to sort of explain this. How familiar are you with the thought experiment?
I don't know of like details, but I'm familiar with like the general notion of what it's trying to say.
We're nearing on this in terms of AI and what we're getting at. What would it be like if we had a fully functional AI that acted like a human, that did everything you would expect a human would do? It would talk with you the way I'm talking with you, it would answer questions. If you asked it if it were conscious, it'd be like, yeah, yeah, of course I'm conscious. Come on, man. Uh, it would be very convincing. But in this dualist perspective, it wouldn't be conscious because it wouldn't have a soul.
Right.
So it'd truly be like a philosophical zombie, is what they would call it.
Yeah. So philosophical zombies, by stipulation, are non-conscious entities that behave in the world as if they are conscious. They certainly appear to be conscious from the outside.
And from the dualist perspective, this is really as close as we can ever get in terms of like building machines or potentially even animals, right? Because if you are a dualist, and it can vary a little bit based on what kind of dualist you are. Let's say you're a dualist in the traditional sense where humans have souls, animals don't. Animals, in some sense, are philosophical zombies because
Mm-hmm.
they don't have this little extra consciousness magic dust coming from the ether.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I think that's one way that helps really illustrate it. So, but let's talk about some of our problems with dualism. Why don't you tell me why you're not a dualist?
Well, I think the most obvious one is having to contend with like modern physical sciences. If there is like some other mind aspect to the universe that influences our bodies and like talks to our bodies, that's to say, like the mind part of the universe is interacting with the matter part, it will cause the matter to change and move in unexpected or unpredictable patterns. Even in principle, it'd be unpredictable. And I think the physical sciences, they it just seems to be that they disagree with that the more and more we learn about the physical world.
I'll push you a little bit on these and then tell you my reasons, which are a little bit different, but there's a bit of overlap there. So
Mm-hmm.
so you say because basically we're able to predict everything, and these mental properties don't causally interact with the world in a way to where it's obvious. Like you would think that if mental things could influence physical things, you'd have some mechanism by which the mental things could overcome the physical things in some sense. Like,
Right.
I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, you could change your center of mass, for example, maybe something like that,
Yeah, yeah,
through the
because
power
like
of thought.
the claim for the dualism is that there's like this mind or something which is separate from the matter but influences the matter. Like it has a causal connection to it, right?
Right. So we
And
should
so
see that somewhere.
yeah, yeah, you'd expect to see like maybe laws of physics being broken every now and again, just whenever a person feels like it, right? Because the mind person sort of like, or the mind aspect somehow trumps the physical laws holding our bodies down or something. They somehow have a control over it.
So you said we'd expect to see things that are really unpredictable, at least in
Right.
terms of physical prediction. We couldn't
It
predict it
couldn't,
physically. Only
yeah,
yeah,
like it couldn't be predictable because like the physical predictions of just matter and motion, well, by the dualist claim, there's this mental entity that is able to like ignore that physical law that matter must move in this motion, and it
right.
changes it somehow.
So anyone who's watched this or anyone who's thought about this a lot or read about this topic, I'm sure the very first thing many people or second thing will be thinking is, well, what about quantum physics? Because in quantum physics, weird, unpredictable stuff happens.
Or
And when you look at the
yeah.
light slit, you're viewing it. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
consciousness somehow breaks the wave function and manipulates the world in that way. So you say we should be able to predict everything in principle physically, and there would be weird, unexpected things happening if mental properties were having influence. So is are mental properties having influence on the quantum world? Because in the quantum world, we see very weird stuff.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's something to do with quantum mechanics and consciousness. However, I don't see any like direct obvious connection myself. There's been I would say a misinterpretation of quantum mechanics
Hmm.
because we have this idea of a wave function, and wave functions describe particles. And whenever you interact with a wave function, it collapses because a wave function is initially kind of spread out over space, and whenever you interact with it, it sort of collapses to one place.
Right. We could illustrate this maybe with the light slit experiment. So the light's filtering through, but whenever you actually look at it,
Well, okay, so the idea, so in terms of like the double slit experiment, maybe you have like a plane of light which hits the slits and then it goes through. So you have this wave of light that's propagating outwards, and when it hits the screen, it's only going to hit the screen at one point on the screen.
hmm,
Even though the wave sort of like spread out and is in some sense as big as the screen, once it hits the screen, it's just going to hit at one spot.
right.
And there's been ideas that consciousness is what causes this wave function collapse.
When a conscious witness looks at it, that's when it collapses, and that's when we see it.
Yeah, and I think that's just a mistake because we say in quantum mechanics when you observe the particle, it collapses, and I think that use of terminology it just got confused with a conscious observer
Right. And
must
this view
interact
of
with it.
dualism, that you would assume like that a human being or maybe a conscious animal has to see it, and then the wave function collapses. But
Yeah, and then something with like, and one of the reasons I think this is a ridiculous like notion is because there was I don't remember his name, but he was arguing that like a human can collapse a wave function and like maybe a dog, but like a rat is not conscious enough to like collapse a wave
right,
function.
yeah,
And then you're just like, oh, okay, hold on. Like, like, are you sure about that? And then, but I think that's just like, it's just a bad notion
because
of what we
a
mean
photon could break
observe.
the wave function, just like a photon from the sun
Hmm.
could break the wave function with no. We can get into the sun as conscious, but at least in terms of this dualist view, it doesn't. It's nonsense.
Yeah. And I think that's like a mistake by physicists because we use the word observe like whenever you observe a quantum system, and that just means interact. Like
Right.
really, it means to like to throw some photons at it and then see what kind of photons it throws back at you, or throw some matter at it and see how it throws the matter back. Right? It's
Right.
just that's what it means to observe.
Some of my objections to dualism aren't necessarily grounded in the physics and such. They're a little bit more in the brain science. So it's it's like if there was the mental properties truly were separate, at least, and especially in the ways a lot of people seem to claim they are, where like memories, personality, things like that are separate. Just the fact that we have cases where we can damage the brain and dramatically change personalities, erase memories, take away ability to use language, all these things that are associated with mental properties, they have correlations in the brain.
Hmm.
And if we damage the brain, you lose those faculties. And it's if you get rid of all those faculties that your brain grants you, I'm not sure with what you're left with. No sight,
Right.
no sound, no smell, no memories, no language. It's what's even happening at that point, you know?
Yep. No, I think that's right along the lines that I was saying. Like, if the mind were separate from the brain, then the neuroscientist, when studying the brain, they would see weird, unpredictable patterns. But what they see are predictable patterns,
Yeah, and the
right?
physical world has an impact on the mental experience. If you're sick or tired, your mental faculties are appropriately affected by the tiredness or the sickness or the injury. Or
Hmm.
if you have a warm drink in your hand, you know that's going to make you feel different.
Yep.
So it's the mind. At no point is the mind going back and changing the temperature of the cup. It's the temperature of the cup is impacting the mind. So yeah, it's just it seems quite it doesn't gel. And on top of
Right.
that, there's nowhere in the brain for the interaction to happen. Like there's no space. There's no space for the inner self, the unchanged self to hide. Like there's
We've looked in the brain.
yeah, we've
Yep.
looked really
Right.
thoroughly and it's a
Yep.
closed system that works completely by itself. I think Descartes, I can't remember this exactly, but he had this idea of the brain as like being the center of intelligence, but the soul and personality and all that stuff was kind of coming from somewhere else and being channeled in, not even through the brain, but through somewhere else. I think I could
Right.
be.
That wouldn't surprise me.
I know he was definitely a dualist in that sense.
Oh yeah, Descartes, like he's famous for starting the dualist like ideas, at least.
So we have a few different answers to this question, other than the dualist answer, with which neither of us agree with. Do you want
Right.
to start with yours, or shall I reject the problem?
um. Well, my view is a little I don't know if it's extreme. Seems a bit extreme. Would you want to end with an extreme view or?
Okay, yeah, yeah. So me and Tyler have pretty different views on this, and we've talked about them a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll just kind of walk through them, and we can just kind of push each other on certain points where we have questions, and see where we end up. So so dualism explains the problem in that way. I take a view which actually denies the problem. There is no problem of why something is conscious, or why we can or can't tell certain things are consciousness. And we sort of got at this earlier, where you said you were 100% sure you were conscious, and you were
Mm-hmm.
very sure that I was conscious. Like you did, was I right when I said you put it in the same area of probability, like the Earth rotating around the sun, for example? Similar
Yeah.
area of okay. And see, to me, that's as good as we need. We don't have to be 100% sure that someone else is conscious. I'm happy with the 99, and such. If I can be as sure something is conscious as I am the Earth rotates around the sun, I don't see the problem. You know, where I'm happy with that, and that explanation works. So there's no hard problem. There's only a bunch of easy problems, and these are problems that we've already sort of touched on of neuroscience in mind. It's not why is it like something to be something. It's how do we get to the point where it is like something to be something in terms of like mental processes and what's going on. Do you what are your first thoughts on that?
Um. It seems I don't quite know how to say it, but it's like you have knowledge of your own immediate awareness of your own consciousness,
Right.
right? And it's hard for me to see how, if we get all these neural correlates down. Whenever this part of the brain lights up, you have this sort of experience, and when that neuron fires, you have this other sort of experience. Um, it seems to me all you've done is explained like behavior. It doesn't seem like you've explained an intrinsic nature of sorts.
What do you mean by intrinsic nature, though?
Right. So in my view, we have a problem of intrinsic natures when it comes to like just matter in general. Um,
Let me try a analogy that might,
mhm,
because I don't think there's a problem with an intrinsic, because people used to think that things were only alive because they had some extra like life spark. It wasn't simply
mhm,
just physical and chemical processes. Um,
right.
it's there had to be an extra little like spice added.
Mhm,
So it's like take an ant. You could ask if an ant's conscious, but you also can ask, is an ant alive? Or
right.
is it some kind of philosophical living zombie? I mean, it's moving, it's behaving like it's alive, it's doing the
Mhm,
things that other living things do, but is it really alive? You know?
mhm, right. So
And
asking alive and consciousness, those are two separate questions in my mind, right?
well, they're similar in that. Well, now it's different, right? Because now we just don't. The distinction between something being alive or not alive just isn't very interesting, I guess. Like is like
I don't
our
think we even have that answer.
exactly. Well, are proteins
Right.
alive? Probably not. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't
Are
know.
viruses alive? Well, that's kind of
I don't
weird.
know.
We don't not maybe not technically, but they kind of act
They
like they're
sort of
alive.
behave it, yeah.
Uh, is a bacteria alive? Well, yeah, I probably.
Maybe it sort of moves around and stuff, yeah.
And is an ant alive? Yeah, certainly the
Mhm,
ant's alive, but at no point was any when you move from the proteins up to the bacteria, at no point was any special like living spark added in. You just have
mhm,
this gradual increase in complexity, and at some point we're
mhm.
like, okay, we're comfortable calling this thing alive. and
Right.
and consciousness to me seems very similar.
Same.
Well, same.
Yeah. Yes. Because I think we have a very rich consciousness, and that is tied closely to um, our brains being highly complex organizations of matter, and it allows for complex experience and stuff of that sort. And then whenever you go like simpler to something like an ant, like you were saying, I do think an ant is conscious, but I think it's just like a lot simpler consciousness. It doesn't have, it's not as rich and complex, and it doesn't have, like, I feel emotions like anger and happiness and awe and stuff of that sort. An ant might not feel that, but in my view, it certainly feels like something to be an ant.
I agree with that. So then would you agree with me there's no hard problem then? Because
Um, well, maybe I should explain my view of
yeah, we can.
what I've been talking about this whole time, which is panpsychism. And this is the idea that, like, what's fundamental in the world is consciousness. And then, like, matter, the properties of matter are just like constituents of consciousness. So, like, at bottom, the world is conscious. And then you build up the material world, like, from that. So, something like mass, that's a form of consciousness, or something like charge, that's just a form of consciousness.
And I need to find where
It's
you
the
disagree with me to get to that point. So we sort of
right.
agreed that like an ant is conscious, and we also agreed that an
Mm-hmm.
ant's alive. Uh,
Yes.
do you think that like a protein is alive?
I don't know if it's alive.
Not like just
I don't think it's alive.
or is an atom alive?
No, I don't think an atom is alive.
So and I would agree, an atom's not alive, a protein's not
Mm-hmm.
alive, a
Mm-hmm.
virus maybe, maybe not, I don't know, but an ant's certainly alive. And
Mm-hmm.
at no point was some special like living property
Right.
added on. Is just a gradual increase in complexity. So I
Mm-hmm.
would agree that again that the ant is conscious. The
Right.
virus maybe not, but and the atom's certainly not conscious in the same way I view alive, because at no point was any special thing added. We have gradual complexity, and then we describe it
Mm-hmm.
as alive. As gradual complexity, we describe it as conscious. So
Mm-hmm.
where's the disconnect there for you?
Well, the disconnect would be, so my view would be that conscious is fundamental. Like, so the properties of an electron are conscious properties, and they're actualized in the world, and they by consciousness, like, right? So an electron has an amount of mass and charge, and those are just different forms of consciousness. And then as you attach an electron to a proton, you get an atom, and an atom is a bit more complex than just a single proton or single electron. And then you start combining atoms together to get molecules, and then eventually you get to us. And at no point was anything added in because it was always there from the beginning.
Well, but at the beginning it was added in as another property to the matter. Well,
No, it is just like that's what's fundamental. Like,
why do you think that?
well, I think it's a good answer to why the fact that we're conscious at all. Like, it's we have to we have to contend, I think, with this fact that we are conscious. Like, I don't think it's an illusion that we're conscious. I think it's a brute fact that we must contend with.
Well, again, to use the analogy, I'll try this just one more time, because I feel like it can point to where we disagree, or maybe you can explain why the analogy doesn't hold. We have to contend with the fact that we're alive. We're alive.
Mm-hmm.
Some things are living, some things aren't living, and when you
Mm-hmm.
get more complex, things seem to be living. Uh, but you wouldn't say that life is fundamental in the atom, because you already seem to express that you don't believe the atom is alive, but you believe it's conscious. So why don't you have to go back and add life into the atom, even though we have this not this emergent property of life that doesn't exist fundamentally? But you do have to do it for consciousness.
Um, well, it's like I think one of the reasons it's because consciousness is the only thing that I'm like sure of. Like, I can't help but it feels like something to be me. Like, I have a picture in my world that's being generated, and
Yeah.
and what I see from physical sciences, especially physics or something, it doesn't give me any sort of account on why that's the case.
But you're also alive. But you're
Yes.
happy to accept the physical and chemical explanations for why you're alive? Or does
I
that
think we
not do
don't
it
have a
for you?
definition for life.
Do we have a definition for consciousness that works?
No,
That's,
no.
I feel like they're very comparable, because the vitalists, they saw this problem. They're like, you can explain the physics and chemistry that makes life happen, but that's still not what it means to be alive. There's some extra thing there, and I have the sense that panpsychists are trying to add in this extra special sauce into the into the fundamental reality to make it work, when they don't demand it for like life, for examples. Maybe you can explain why life and consciousness aren't good analogies, or something else.
Because I think without life, consciousness would still exist.
But what is the basis
Consciousness
for
is
that
like,
belief?
um, it just, well, the basis is that it's in my view, like an easy and reasonable explanation for why we're conscious at all.
So I think So let's talk about this then, the why of consciousness, why we're conscious at all.
Hmm.
So you would say it would make sense if it was a fundamental part of reality. I would say something like it's a evolutionary adaptation, because being able to have this ability to sort of reflect and react in certain ways is useful for passing on your genes, and that develops to varying degrees in different organisms according to their need.
Hmm.
So it's simply an emergent user phenomenon for the brain. It's an emergent phenomenon for the brain to use itself.
Self-reflection seems to be uniquely human.
I wouldn't say so, but
But what do you
we're
mean by
certainly the best.
self-reflection then?
Certainly for humans, it's definitely the most profound and useful. We take it to very far extremes, but no, I mean certainly there are other creatures who can reflect on what's happening to them and do things differently. That's something that happens. I'm quite sure of that. To take a really clear example, I recall some researchers, they were teaching a parrot various words, and they gave it some different color puzzles. Well, they'll tell it to get the red thing or the green thing or whatever, and so on and so forth. And at some point, the parrot started asking what color it was.
Right.
And I felt like it was a pretty good example of self-reflection in a non-mammal.
Hmm.
Um, Chimps can clearly do it. You do experiments where you put a little something on them, and then you show them in the mirror, and if they recognize it as them, they'll clean it off. Right?
Right, right.
That shows that
Hmm.
there's a conception of the self in some degree.
Right. I see what you're saying.
Uh, Now, an ant doesn't do that. It doesn't have the appropriate faculties to do that, and we can know that by looking at like the brains and which parts of the brains do that. But they still have
Hmm.
some like glimmer of it, I think, and that just comes in their ability to follow certain chemical signals and respond to them.
Well, I would say something like self-reflection is just like a possible form of consciousness.
Right. Yeah, it's not the only thing in
Right.
consciousness, but
Whereas an ant with no self-reflection is just conscious in a different way.
yeah, I don't have a problem with that. It's like a different form of
Yeah.
consciousness, but
But if we just, so one of the motivations for my view on panpsychism is that whenever I try to start with the most complex thing I know about, which would be at least like the human brain or something like that,
right.
right? As a starting point, I certainly know that's conscious, right? At least one example in all the universe, my own brain, I know that it's conscious. And so it's either the fact that only I'm conscious and nothing else is, and I could just be mistaken, or there's like other conscious things out there, right? And then if I try to go simpler, let's start at the most complex thing and then like work down to a rock. In my view, I see no reason for consciousness to ever just disappear. It just seems to get simpler and simpler. And then once you get down to like fundamental particles, well, you have the most simple form of consciousness, and it's actualized in the world in the form of a particle or something like that.
Well, to talk about the why again, I gave you an example for why I think it's a
Right.
useful biological adaptation. What's your problem with that explanation for why? As an emergent
Um,
adaptation rather than something fundamental.
it seems like a useful behavior for just, or it seems like a useful description for behavior. I think it's adjacent to consciousness. It seems to be mostly a behavior driven explanation. And I think the problem of consciousness is the fact that like we can explain what stuff does, right? And very well with physics at least. We know how stuff works, and with brain science, we know when stuff happens over here, like how it correlates to experiences and stuff. But we're not saying anything about what stuff is.
Well, let's. I think I get what you're saying. Are you saying that? Okay, I'm saying that it's simply a useful adaptation. And are you trying to get at something that says like you a biological system could perform all the necessary functions without being conscious? It doesn't need to be conscious. Is that what you're getting at, or is it something else? Because I don't quite
No,
understand
no,
why you think it
it's
has to be
not that because
fundamental instead of emergent.
because yeah, this is a hard question. Is essentially starting with what I know is that this bit of matter in the universe, this little bit of it is conscious, right? That's my starting point. Essentially, is that some of the matter in the universe is conscious.
Yeah. And why can't it be an emergent consciousness? Or why do you think it's more likely to be a fundamental consciousness rather than an emergent consciousness?
Um,
Because it
because
seems almost like a logical fallacy when you say, because it's like, I see some matter in the universe has a temperature, therefore
mhm,
everything has like, how are
right.
we explain?
It's funny you use that example because matter does have temperature. Um,
Well, like,
so
not
like
like
all matter has temperature.
a single electron doesn't have a temperature. That's
Uh,
because you would say
yeah,
a single
sort
electron
of.
has consciousness, but it
I would
just
no, I would say like it. That's what consciousness is.
right.
It's not. It doesn't like. It doesn't have consciousness. It's just like at bottom, the world is consciousness, and then
Right, but
from that you get the laws of physics and conscious creatures and such.
why do you think that's more likely than it simply being an emergent phenomenon, like something like temperature, for example?
It's because I don't think consciousness is what stuff does. That's why.
You don't think it's functional?
Right. I don't think it's behavior of matter. I don't think that's what consciousness is.
Do
I
you
think consciousness is the fact that it feels like to be some part of matter.
do you think consciousness is useful
Um,
for?
do I think it's
Do you think it's
useful?
useful for biological things, organisms?
Um, I don't know because in my view that would be similar to asking is mass useful?
You see, because to me,
Yeah, of course it's useful.
I see a spectrum of consciousness, and it seems to
Hmm.
me that it is adaptive, and beings who have forms of consciousness that are closer to ours have significant
Hmm.
advantages over others. To take like the parrots or the chimps, I mean they're incredibly successful compared to some other creatures that don't have as much consciousness. If you could imagine an
Right.
ant
Well, I
that
mean,
was,
something like an ant. Ants are extremely successful.
well, yeah, there's a lot of them. They have some other, they
Yeah.
have other features which make them successful other than consciousness. But imagine ants who were as fully self-aware as we were. I could imagine them making some staggering improvements to the way they work if they were able to really reflect on what they were doing.
Right. Yeah, and for what I hear from this is that like the ants would act differently, right?
If they had the capacity for greater consciousness by having a more
Yeah.
complex
If they were,
nervous system or whatever. Yeah.
uh, yeah. Well, it seems a little, well, it's like, it's completely reasonable because if the ant were something else, then it would act differently. That's like, that seems like clearly obvious.
Not differently though, but more effectively, because I'm contending that consciousness is a useful biological adaptation, not some incidental fundamental part of the universe. I view
Hmm.
consciousness like a this comes from Dennett, who calls consciousness an illusion, and 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 I've said that to you, and I think you've had a problem with that term before.
Right. It couldn't be an illusion. It's the thing that I'm most sure of in all of existence is the fact that I am conscious.
Well, let me explain what he means by illusion, because illusions doesn't mean it's not there or it's not real. It just means it's not what you think it is, or it's different. The way he describes the illusory nature of consciousness is the same way your phone screen, for example, like you have a phone screen and it has
Hmm.
buttons and pictures and stuff on it, and it's an illusion. It's a user illusion, because that's not what's actually going on in the phone. There's this crazy calculations, and if you saw what was really going on in the phone, you wouldn't even be able to use it because it'd be far
Hmm.
too complex and stuff. Uh, there's a little trash can on here on my desktop. There's a little trash can image, and I can put things in there or throw it away. But there's no actual trash can in there. It's simply
Right.
a useful illusion. And consciousness, in this view, which I share, is the same thing. It's a user illusion for the brain to use itself.
Hmm. I guess I just don't understand fully what he means by that.
Well, which part? I mean, I'll tell you what I mean.
So, in this view, your brain produces consciousness to help it make decisions and act in the world.
Right, because we have an immensely complex brain with all these
Hmm.
sensory inputs. We're getting so much information constantly, in a very similar way to where your phone's getting tons and tons of constantly.
Hmm.
And then this for this reflection aspect of consciousness to work appropriately, we have to significantly narrow down what we're actually looking at. Um, and that's this illusion we have of our own self-awareness, of our own ability to think about this and talk about this and ask about this. This is us looking at the phone screen of our own brain. The brain, we are our brain, but it is us looking at ourselves through this very condensed and focused view. And that's what the self-awareness is.
I'm not sure. I don't quite know where the friction is, to be honest. Because like something like temperature,
Uh-huh.
we call temperature an emergent phenomenon.
Right. Because a single particle doesn't have a temperature.
There's no illusion of temperature though. Temperature is real. We can measure it. Like we use it in our equations. Like
Right.
this, yeah. Emergent doesn't mean like not real.
Right. And consciousness isn't not real. It's just not what it seems to be on the surface. And neither is
What is
temperature.
it? Okay, what does it seem to be then?
Well, it's at first pass it seems to be this dualist idea of where we're like souls in a body, and we're just viewing things happening from some other realm, and we're just sort of channeling. We're not our bodies, but we have bodies.
Hmm.
Um and then you might look closer and be like, okay, that's nonsense. And then in this, I would say the illusionary part in the panpsychist view would be to look at like a rock and think it's conscious, because, well, I'm conscious, I'm made of matter, that rock's made of matter, therefore it's conscious. And I think it's just a mistake. But I think the reality of consciousness is this user illusion, this a user illusion, but it's a useful illusion. We're not interfacing with the world directly on a one-to-one basis. We're making
Hmm.
this useful user illusion, which I like an interface, a graphical interface, like on your phone, like on your computer, which are illusions. They're not, the stuff isn't there. It's a complete fraudulent thing, but it's incredibly useful. And it is, in fact, the most important thing that there is to us. So I think maybe illusion's the wrong word to use. Um, but it's not real in the sense that there's like this extra special conscious spark.
Hmm. I think maybe that last sentence, it not being real, because in my view, consciousness is the most real thing there is.
Well, the screen on your phone is real, right? And the icons are real, and
Hmm.
but they aren't representing what is actually there. They're massively simplifying it and giving it to you in a way that's easy to use.
Right.
That's the thing that's not real. It's the icon, the trash can, or the house, or the forest, whatever's on your phone screen. That's what's not real, and that's the part of consciousness which is not real.
Okay, maybe if we take it like this, what if we start with some atoms,
Okay.
which you don't think are conscious, and we start combining these atoms, and at some point we get to a human.
Okay.
Before we get to a human, like, what happens to the user interface as we go backwards? Does the user interface just get simpler and simpler, and then it disappears at some point?
Right. Yeah.
Like, how would you figure out where this user interface ends?
Well, this is how a lot of things work in our world, right? We don't know where things begin. When does a few pieces of corn become a heap of corn? It's not one piece, it's not two, it's not three, but at some point you have a heap.
Right,
Uh, every life works in this way, as we used before. Evolution works in this way. Like, when does a certain species become another species? There's no like one point. It's a gradual fading in and fading out. And just because we can't point to the one moment, oh, that's where the consciousness turns on, that I don't think that makes it an incoherent concept.
right. But I don't even see like where. So like we start with a singular atom, which the claim is no consciousness at all,
Right.
and then now we have two atoms. Now we have three and four and five, and once we get to like a few hundred, there's some pretty complex interactions happening there.
Yeah. Once we have a biological being that has the right mutation or whatever, and it develops its own user interface. It might just be a one button interface, off on, who knows.
Right,
But yeah, at some point we're gonna be seeing that, and it won't be like no button and then boom button. It's gonna be the gradual fading in of that first button. It's not a
right. Well, the panpsychist has no. Like, if you take the panpsychist view that consciousness is fundamental, then as you get more and more complex creatures, you just have more and more complex forms of
Well,
consciousness.
that's one problem with the panpsychist view, right? Is you wouldn't expect anything to be different if it were true. Everything would be
Right, but
exactly
I
as it
would
is.
claim I would claim that's a strength of panpsychism, is that we're not adding anything else to the world. We have to contend with physics. We have to make sure that what physics says is true. And also, but we're asking this question about consciousness, in which my view, physics has absolutely nothing to say on.
But you're just adding this extra quality that doesn't need to be there. It's because I can explain it perfectly fine in terms of evolution.
Right. But the fact that I am conscious means I have to explain it somehow.
Well, I
Like there
have.
is a
You're a
there's a
complex
fact.
biological. What's wrong with my explanation that you're a complex biological organism who has a user interface to filter in information? What's
Well, if we just the problem is make me simpler and simpler.
mhm.
In your view, like the user interface will shut off at some point.
Well, no, no, no. It won't just like be on and
Well,
then
once we
off.
well once we get to the atom, it'll be off, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's take
Right.
you. Let's put you into
Right.
a coma where all your higher brain functioning is off. Nothing's going on in there. There's nothing like to be you. It's just nothing. And uh I'm gonna play some of your favorite music inside of the operating room, and we'll look at your brain, and like nothing's happening. He's clearly not conscious, not enjoying this at all. And say we give you whatever you need to start slowly waking up, and one by one your neurons will flip on, and maybe a little bit flips on. You still aren't really recognizing the music. Some like basic functions are happening. And then at some point we'll see something turn on and like, oh, he's hearing this music. And then at some point it's gonna be, oh, he's recognizing this music. And at some point you're gonna be awake. You'll be like, oh, I love this song. And you'll be fully 100% conscious. even though we started from a
Right.
place of zero consciousness,
Right.
and it gradually fades in, and that's how it works. You can take this analogy and use it with the organisms as well. It's a gradual fading in. It's not a off and then on.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. Like I said, I don't quite know where the friction is
Maybe
because
we could try with some
I
thought
feel like
experiments.
the evolutionary description that you've given helps us explain animal behavior, but we don't talk about like what an animal is. We just talked about like how it moves around.
Well, I mean, once you've described all of its behavior and why it does that and how it does that, like, what else is there? How about, I
The
think,
intrinsic nature. That's what would be
well, I
left.
would
Like
deny
you've
the intrinsic
described,
nature.
right? So something like an atom has these properties of mass and charge and whatnot, and we describe mass in terms of gravitational fields, and we describe charges by electric fields and such. But that's just like we describe mass by what it does. We don't describe mass by what it is.
How about we? I remember you said Nagel's bats was a good way to talk to work with panpsychism. How about let's try this and see if we can find some where friction.
I'm unsure. So I did think about this. I'm unsure if it'll help a ton here with panpsychism, but I think Nagel's bats has, or the panpsychist has no qualms with Nagel's bats. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And the idea of this thought experiment, what's his name?
Well, it might get to where we disagree because I don't
Right.
think there's any problem here, and I think you do. So, yeah.
Well, a philosopher in the 60s, 70s, something like that, he wrote a paper describing that this view of consciousness that I've been talking about, that like something is conscious if it feels like to be that thing. And he used an example of bats. And he said bats are conscious because it feels like something to be a bat. And it feels a lot different than our consciousness because bats have echolocation. And so their way of viewing and seeing the world is, while conscious, is different than ours. It's just the fact at all that the bat, it feels like something to be a bat is good enough to say that the bat is conscious.
And Nagel would claim that you couldn't imagine what it was like to be a bat, no matter how much you learned about it. No matter you could know everything about the brain chemistry and
Hmm.
neurology of the bat, but you wouldn't know what it was like to be that bat, and
No,
you would maybe say the same thing.
right. I would say you would have to be a bat to know what it's like to be a bat, right? That makes sense to me.
I think I don't know if this gets at where we disagree, but I don't think I think you could imagine what it's like to be a bat. Now let me try. So you would also say that you couldn't imagine what it's like to be me.
In order for me to know what it's like to be you, I would literally have to be you. If I wanted to know like what it was like to be you, I would have to change my brain and I would have to like replicate your brain. And then I would know what it's like to be you. But it wouldn't be really like I know what it's like to be you. It would be like you would know what it's like to be you because I would just be like another you, right?
So I do think that just with science and third person descriptions, we can
Mhm.
actually get you there, or at least very close. I mean, and in reality, it would take a lot, but
Mhm.
like, um, one time for my birthday, we went to a Steve Vai concert, and it was a whole
Right.
lot of fun. And at during the concert, we were standing there, we were listening to the music, and you are were having these conscious experiences, different ones,
Mhm.
ones that were kind of confined within our brains. And sort of your claim would be that there's no like extra descriptions or scientific work we could do that could sort of to let you know what I was experiencing.
Right. So, in my view, if we had a perfect neuroscience, we knew every possible conscious to brain correlate. Like if this part of the brain changes, you have this sort of conscious experiment.
Hmm.
If we knew that perfectly, you're still missing the fact that we have a first person awareness of the stuff, whereas everything we've described before is a third person.
Well, so but I feel like we can use third person to get to first person. So like let's say during one of the song he plays a song that I actually know how to play. And whenever he's playing it, I get some of those memories of learning how to play it, and have some more appreciation for some of the parts because I'm like, oh wow, I know that part's really hard. Oh my gosh, he does it so easily, and that really has an impact on my experience. And
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't. That was completely absent for you. You never learned to play it. You just heard it and loved it. And if I wanted to get our experiences closer, I wanted to show you what it was like to be me. We could sit down and I could show you how I learned it and walk you through it. And then you could
Mm-hmm.
imagine like, oh, if I had known this when I did that, it was probably more like that. And I've now sort of pulled your ability from third person description to understand what my first person experience was like.
Right. The problem is you. I don't see how you could be sure that I have it down what you were thinking.
Well,
Because,
yeah.
like, if it comes to something like gravity, for instance, that seems to be a completely third person. And I can tell you all the things that you need for gravity to work, all of the mathematical structures and how mass interacts with space time and
Yeah,
such.
but where does gravity
And
come from?
but the point I'm trying to make is that I can be sure that you understand what gravity is because you'll be able to maybe write it down and like explain back to me some facts of the matter.
Hmm.
But I feel like when it comes to consciousness, that kind of sureness is guaranteed to never happen. Like you're guaranteed to never be sure about somebody else's
Well, in the
consciousness.
same way, you can be guaranteed to never be 100% sure about gravity, right? Uh, in the same way, you can't be sure the Earth is rotating around the sun. You can't be sure that, like,
Right, but I have like access to different information. Like
I think the
when
gravity
it
is a great
comes
example though because, like I said, you show me all that. I'm like, well, where does the gravity come from? And you're like, I don't know. There might be a gravity particle we haven't discovered yet. And I'm like, well, you know what? All atoms have this new property I'm gonna call nifty, and because all particles have this property of nifty, that's it generates gravity, and that's where gravity comes from. That's how it works.
yeah, but we call that mass. That's sort of how it worked.
But that's not the. I mean, it's an explanation, but it's not a very. It doesn't do anything for you. It's like,
It doesn't get into the intrinsic nature.
and that's what I see you doing with this with the panpsychism. And I don't get how, like, surely you agree that my third person account telling you this, even though it can't be positive, we can be reasonably certain that you now understand my experience better.
Right, but that's not to say I had the
But if we
experience.
knew, I wouldn't say you have to have it. But the claim of the bat thing is that we can't imagine what it's like to be a bat. We would have to be a bat for
Right.
that. But with these third person experiences, we can get closer and closer and closer. And if we truly knew everything, I don't see how you couldn't be satisfied with that ability of imagining. Like if we went through the Steve Vai concert, I went through every moment for you, and I explained
Mm-hmm.
everything that was going through my mind and why and how we got there, and I walked you through all those processes.
Right.
It
Right.
you wouldn't have had my experience, no, but
Mm.
you could perfectly understand what it was like to be me in that moment. if we truly covered everything. And I think you could do the same thing with a bat.
So in so if there were like an alien species on another planet with they had like a lead atmosphere and they had molten titanium lakes and they had to develop completely different senses than the ones we are used to here on Earth with our thin air and water and nice kind of stuff. Those creatures on that crazy lead atmosphere planet with titanium lakes and just some crazy stuff, those creatures would be conscious. Like they would have an awareness of their environment and the stuff around them and such. But I don't see how I could possibly imagine what it's like from their first person's perspective. We're both conscious, but like there's no chance I'm gonna know what it's like to see through a lead atmosphere and swim in titanium lakes and like the any of the crazy things that's happening on their planet. There's no amount of telling me, oh sure, they see this or they do that, and I'll like surely like I'll understand, okay, they sort of see that and all, but I won't. It's different than like my knowledge of my first person perspective is so immediate. It's right there. Like I couldn't be mistaken about what's there.
Well,
Like
well,
it's
you
just
could.
it's
You can be mistaken
no,
about
it
your own
would
experience. You can't be
no, you can't.
you can't
You
be
can't be
mistaken that
mistaken
it's
about the
happening,
experience itself.
but you can be
You
mistaken about all the qualities of it.
no, you can't. Like that would be that's nonsensical.
What do you
Like
mean?
the experience may not be representative of reality,
Hmm.
if that's what you mean. That could be true, but the experience of it, like the experience itself, there's no way to be mistaken of it. It's just that's what it is, and it's
Well, in a technical sense, like in the moment, of course, but the very next moment, you could have immediately misremembered something. Like as far as like a continuous experience goes, you can be very mistaken about what's going on.
yeah. My experiences may not have an exact account
Even
for
outside
reality.
reality, you could be like, there could have been a car that drove by and you saw it. You saw the car drive by, but you
Yes,
immediately forget about it. And then someone asks
right.
you about the car, you're like, "Oh, I didn't see a car." And as far as your
Hmm.
experience concerned, you didn't see the car. Even though you did, you just forgot. So like as a matter
Right.
of continuous experience, I think you can be very much mistaken about it.
Misremembering, sure. Like you can misremember that. That seems possible, but you can't be mistaken what you're experiencing in the moment. Like it just you can't miss like that's just what your reality
Yeah.
is.
Well, let's say like we take one of the aliens in and we study them and we learn about how their brains work, which are very different from
Hmm.
ours.
Right.
But we
Right.
learned that they correlate with certain things, like whenever, like say they like eating a snack, and whenever they eat the snack, this part of their brain goes on, and also a very similar part of their brain goes on whenever they're swimming in the titanium lakes. If we were able to, we would eventually be able to draw some correlations, and we make some claims like, well, swimming in the titanium for them is a lot like swimming in really cold water for us. And then you could imagine what it was like to swim in the titanium for that alien. And I feel like that's good enough.
Right. I guess that's where the disconnect comes in, is that it doesn't seem good enough to me. Because when it comes to something like physics, we have like insane certainty on our equations and stuff.
Well, on some things, but on other things, we don't have that much certainty, and it can get pretty speculative. But we still, at some point, we're like, well,
Right.
this is the best we can do, and that's good enough.
Yeah.
I don't see why consciousness has to sit on this special pedestal.
Well, it's separate from everything else in that, like, that we see out there.
If
Consciousness is weird.
it's there's
The
there's
fact that we're
definitely
conscious, the fact that we're conscious at all, I think, is extremely weird.
uh so 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 the Steve Vai concert. You at least agree that in principle I could go over like every moment and every thought I had and communicate it to you in a way to where you could really say that you understand what was happening for me, or do you not?
I could never.
Not that you had the
There,
experience, but
there
that
is
you
a
understand it.
there's a hard limit. There's definitely a hard limit because you could tell me all the facts about, like during the concert, you could have had a brain machine on your brain recording all
Right.
of your brain activity. And then we could have gone through moment by moment and you said, with this brain activity, this is the experience and stuff. I feel like you could tell me that with infinite precision and you would be missing some data. Like I would be missing some data. I wouldn't have the full picture. Even with a perfect, infinitely precise correlation there.
Well, it would be
Yeah.
perfect. I mean, no description is going to be perfect, but
Right. But I mean, in this thought experiment, we're just allowing this perfect description. And even in that case, I feel like there is missing data. And that's your first person awareness of what was happening at the time. That's the missing data. And that's data I do not have access to and cannot, in principle, have access to unless I am you.
well, right. I
Then
mean,
I have access to
if we
it.
took this to its really far extremes, I mean, we erase your memories of your past, and we replace them with mine, and for a moment,
Mm-hmm.
we have you become me for a moment,
Yeah.
and then we put
And
it
then
back.
I would know. And then I would know. Right. But the only way I know it's because I became you momentarily. But like once I become me again, like I've lost access to that information
Well,
again.
we
Like I
could
no
still
longer have
maintain
it.
that experience in your memory, though. We would just erase my memories we had put in you, and then replace them back
Right.
with
But
yours.
once those your memories are erased from me, I don't have access to those anymore.
But
I don't have that first person access awareness to it.
we could leave the memory of the experience of that happening.
Yeah, and then I would have and then I would have complete access to it.
But you would no longer be me, because we could. I'm saying we could keep that memory without getting rid of all my other ones. Like, so we could just for a moment replace your memories
Mm-hmm.
with mine
Right.
and put you through the
Yep.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
Then put your memories back that we had replaced before, maintaining
Sure.
the one experience. You would now have had
The,
my first person perspective.
yes. Yes. But I didn't have that information from all of the data you told me. We spent the last 3 decades going nanosecond by nanosecond, each possible moment in time. You've told me everything that could happen. It wasn't until we changed my brain into yours in some sense that I learned the extra information of that first person immediate awareness.
But nothing.
I
Yeah. But my point is that at no point did some little spark of consciousness hop over from my brain into yours.
No, but I did gain some information. I gained information that I didn't have before because the information I had before was all the correlates. Like whenever you were doing this, this is what you're experiencing. Whenever we were at this is what you're experiencing. Sure, I have all of that. But it's only whenever my brain becomes yours is that there's something else, there's an extra bit of data there that I didn't have before with all those
I
facts.
feel like it's such a that piece of data, that final piece, is I feel like it's just so not relevant because yeah, you would get whatever was lost in translation from the third person thing, yeah, because some stuff
And
is going to get lost.
I couldn't be mistaken either.
But if we qualified though that in our explanation that I don't get anything wrong, I explain it perfectly and clearly, and
Right.
you understand it perfectly
Mm-hmm.
and clearly,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we get to that point anyway. Because the only thing that extra step is going to give to you is the stuff that got lost in translation.
Right, but there is nothing lost in translation by stipulation.
Right. So
Like you're stipulating that nothing was lost, but it, in my view, even under the stipulation, it we have a contradiction. That's what I see is a contradiction in that view because we've stipulated that we know everything, but somehow whenever my brain becomes your brain, I've somehow learned something else.
well, you've experienced something else, but you haven't learned anything, which is
Well, I've
different.
learned what the experience is like.
Well, you already knew what the experience is like from my very detailed, thorough.
I knew a lot of the facts about it, but I didn't have like that first person subjective awareness of it.
To know all the facts and to think about it, to imagine it,
Hmm.
knowing all the facts is to know what it's like.
Yeah, I think that's where a disagreement is. I don't think that's the case. Because I feel like all the facts are the behavior of matter. I think that's what at bottom line what these facts are just you're telling me how the matter behaved. And that seems to be it.
I'm gonna try one more attempt at at budging
Uh-huh.
you on this. So I tell you that I like the song because this part's really hard because when you do this thing with your hand X and Y, um, and you understand that, and I would say you have a better picture of what it was like to be me then. And if we went to another concert and he did it and he played it slightly differently, you'd be like, oh, that's not what John Henry told me it was going to be like, so that's not what it was like for him. What I just experienced there because it was different from the data. Even though you weren't the first person perspective, simply the third person account of what I've given you has changed it.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Because I feel like all the physical facts of the matter don't necessarily like they're not the same as the experience.
Well, do you get it in the guitar example, like how I could completely describe to you how I felt because of all these factors, and then if we change some of the factors, even despite you not having the first person experience, you can already know that it wasn't the same as my experience from that, or not anything like my experience.
Well, I could perhaps know that like the experiences are different, but that's not to say I know what your experience was.
So, person, you or Mary, doesn't matter, has
Mm-hmm.
never been in state X.
Right.
But person knows everything about state X. She's
Mm-hmm.
never been in state X, or you never been in state X. But that doesn't mean that you guys can't imagine what it would be like to be in state X given your knowledge of it.
Right.
Because you can describe everything about the relations between state X and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing those relations, you can know enough about the state to have a good understanding of what it's going to be like, to such that if it's different, you would recognize it immediately.
So I do agree that you can learn a lot about a lot of facts about this place, and sort of imagine what it's like to be there. But in my view, once you go there, you will gain new data. You will now understand what it's like to be there.
If you have like a precise description of everything
Mm-hmm.
about the neurophysiology
Right.
and all the details, I don't see how you would be unable to imagine what it's like. To imagine what it's like to a degree that's satisfying to everybody.
Like, yeah. You just told me how some matter moves around in my brain. But like that tells me nothing about the first person experience of my brain.
Well, I mean, that
There's
the matter
certainly
is part of it, but
correlations
that's not
there.
all of it.
There's certainly correlations there. And we could get infinitely precise correlations, but you're always going to miss that first person data, like that I have access to. Like, I'm looking at my computer screen, I can tell you everything. I can start with the top left pixel and work all the way to the bottom right, tell you everything on here.
And I could imagine that really well.
Yes, but my experience of my computer screen will be more complete than any possible imagination of what you could have it, because I'm experiencing it directly, first person. It's right here. And if you wanted to experiencing it in the same full way, you would have to be right here looking at it. Like, you can't get around that, I don't think.
Well, if you explained it truly perfectly, and
Yes.
I understood it truly perfectly, I don't see what the distinction would be between our understanding of the experience or ability to imagine
Right.
it, recollect it, or
I think it's because I've given you like a third person point of view. I can't. It's hard for me to tell you my first person perspective.
well, it's hard. But if we stipulate that you do it perfectly, you explain it perfectly, and I understand it perfectly, I don't see where the bar is for me being able to imagine it. So I think we disagree in two places. Then we disagree on whether it's fundamental, and then we also disagree, or is it tied? Is it tied, the disagreement between it being fundamental and the problem of being able to actually, the gap in knowledge, I guess, between, I mean, the hard problem. There's the hard problem, and then there's also just the issue of panpsychism, because we could agree on one and not the other, but I think we disagree on both of those.
Yeah. So I think there definitely is a hard problem. I think the fact that we have this first person awareness is at odds with our physical sciences. That's what I see. Because whenever I came to college, I went for a physics degree, and one of the hopes was that physics would maybe help me understand something about myself or human nature or the world or something like that. Just curious about the universe, right? And what I've learned about physics is it has absolutely nothing to say about my first person experience. And it's like,
Right.
it's so far. And it seems to me that like, it seems to me, duh, that's not what physics is about.
Right. It's a completely
That's not what
different
physics
level.
does. Yeah.
It's a whole nother level of description.
Well, I don't know if it's a level. It's just like a whole nother description. Like, I don't want to like compare them on like separate levels or something. They're just,
Well,
physics is not in the business of describing consciousness. That's not what it does.
well, because consciousness is a higher level phenomenon. I mean, if panpsychism is true, then maybe physics is in the business of it. But
like temperature is a higher level emergent phenomenon.
I mean, it's
But
like slightly
physics,
higher. The higher level
physics
is like
physics describes that.
right.
Physics describes temperature.
The next level from physics would be like chemistry, like, because you're talking about bonds and stuff and things that you don't really touch in physics. So you have like the lower level
Right.
of physics, and then you have chemistry, and then you have biology, and then you have sociology and psychology, and like those are the levels I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Consciousness
And in
is
my
higher.
mind, like all of these levels are just like They're just different matter descriptions,
Right,
right?
yeah.
What matter does,
Well, that's why I describe it as
just
levels,
like,
because like physics is here on the bottom. It's like you can't get more.
right. But all these descriptions are what matter does.
Mhm.
They have nothing to say about what it is.
Well, well, I place consciousness firmly in the just in between the biology and psychology camp. It's like right there with neurophysiology.
Yeah. That seems, yeah. I guess that's where the disagreement is.
To me, saying that like asking why are we conscious? It's a lot like asking why do rivers bend, and it's like what, and we can answer we can talk about why rivers move the way they move, and we can describe all the things. And to me, that's a satisfying explanation for why rivers bend. And I feel like
Hmm.
it seems like you want to say like, yeah, but why don't they just run straight? Like, why do all these factors do this rather than that? Or it's like you're looking for an extra piece of explanation other than just rivers bend because water and gravity and rocks do this thing. It's like you want this extra little piece, and I don't know. I don't know why.
Mm, well, it's essentially just the idea that, like, I'm conscious and I'm aware that I'm conscious. And whenever I do physics, it appears that it will never, in principle, be able to say anything about the thing.
Okay. Let's talk about why this is important. We don't agree, but
Right.
I think we do agree that it's relevant for some things. I think it's relevant for suffering because conscious awareness seems to tie directly with suffering to me. Although, in your view, I mean, like if a rock is to some degree conscious, even if it's very dim, like can a rock suffer? How do you view
Right.
that?
Probably not. Right. Suffering seems to be a pretty high level complex, like, phenomenon in consciousness.
So you would say that suffering emerges at sufficiently high levels of consciousness? At what level would you
Yeah.
say?
Yeah.
If you had to
Or
guess.
whatever.
Can ants
I don't
suffer?
know. I don't know, honestly. No idea. I
If you had to guess.
I don't know if, like, an ant could be happy either.
Right.
But, like, happy and suffering would be, like, the same sort of, at least very close in terms of their, like, complexity.
Some
Like, maybe suffering is a bit more at bottom. Like, I could see how suffering could be, like, easier to construct than happiness.
well, that's
Yeah.
that there this is a that's a non-controversial claim if you're an empiricist, but uh
Right. So in that sense, I don't know exactly where suffering would appear in a spectrum of life,
well, I
but I
mention
don't know
it
if it would be everywhere.
I mention it because it definitely matters. Like if your Roomba suffers, I mean you don't want to kick it.
Oh yeah, suffering is really important. I agree because, like, we use suffering as a basis for, like, our ethical intuitions and such.
And as our computers get more complex and we get true artificial intelligence, the question of whether they can suffer or not is quite a big one.
Yeah, that's an important one. Yep, I agree.
And it matters especially with different views because if dualism is true, which neither you and I accept, uh, then machines could never suffer, no matter how complex we make them.
Right.
But if you and I are right and dualism isn't true, and it's actually possible for machines to suffer, but we live in a world populated by people who believe in dualism, they might severely mistreat these machines when they're really bad. If panpsychism is true, I mean, you have to really. I mean, it depends, but you, in some sense, you have to be open to the idea of not mistreating anything. I mean, as low as a thermostat, like
Hmm. Yeah, with the panpsychism view, you definitely have a close relationship to the rest of the universe.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. You're definitely responsible for the things around you and such.
Where in a view that's more like mine, something like a Roomba is not likely to be conscious, but definitely AI
Mm-hmm.
has the ability to improve itself or reflect in any way would definitely be a candidate. So it really does matter. I wish there were better ways to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a hard question.
I wish there were better ways to convince people, because obviously I think I'm right, and it seems so obvious to me. I don't know why it's so hard. Maybe I'm not right, and that's why it's so hard to convince people. But
Yeah.
uh,
It's just the first person. Well, it seems I think one issue is that science has been so successful. I think that's a problem when it comes to something like consciousness. Because science has been so successful, I feel like we could mistakenly think that science will be able to explain anything, maybe, even such things as
it's a
consciousness.
bit of an inductive argument, right? To say that, oh, science explained this thing that we thought would never be explained, and explained this thing that we thought would never be explained. So it's probably going to
Mm-hmm.
keep doing that. But um, we never thought we'd understand physics in terms of Newton. Then after Newton, I think it was Immanuel Kant who said there will never be an Isaac Newton for a blade of grass. And then
Right.
Darwin came
And
along,
then there was. Yeah.
uh, and then the universe. We haven't quite had our. Uh, I mean, and then Einstein, of course, showed us a lot of things that we
Mm-hmm.
thought we would never understand. And I definitely have, I would call inductive faith, just based on the success of science, that we will get answers to some of the questions of the cosmos and consciousness. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's unfounded. I do think it is a powerful inductive argument.
Yeah. I do think. I think that's one of the issues, though, is that science has been successful, and then we just say science will continue to be successful at some of these things. But it seems like like I've said, since science has been successful in describing behavior of matter, right? Not what matter is, unless you somehow think those are the same. That what matter does is just what matter is.
Well, I mean, science does describe what things are. I mean, in
Physics describes what things do. It's not what it is. Like we describe an electron by how it interacts with other things. We don't describe an electron like by
well, that's
itself.
the only way you can describe anything. That's just a problem with describing, not even just scientifically, but like, I mean, how do you talk about like to take qualia? How do you talk about like what red is without referencing something else? Like that's how explaining things work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think you can explain red in terms of behavior. Like the experience of red, I don't think can be captured by describing how particles move around.
Well, you just say it's what your brain's user interface represents to you when it wants to quickly communicate uh like what a certain spectrum of light bouncing into your
Right. Well,
eyes.
like where is the interface?
What do you
Like
mean where?
it's in the brain, definitely, right?
What do you mean? The red isn't anywhere. The red is simply like
But I definitely see it.
where's
That's
the
the issue.
recycling bin on your monitor? Like
the the issue is
nowhere.
I see color.
Yeah.
Like that's where it is. I can see it. It's clearly right there in front of me and all around me. I think that's the issue.
I'm looking at the recycling bin on my desktop right now.
Mm-hmm.
Where's that recycling bin? I see it. It's right there. I can
Mm-hmm.
put things in it.
Yes. That means it's right there.
It's in my computer. Is it where this processing's going on? Is it in the monitor itself? Oops. No, it's nowhere. It's a simple. it's an illusion in that sense. It's a useful shortcut, but there's no red anywhere. A red is just like the recycling bin.
Yeah.
Objects
No,
don't
I've
have a
heard.
redness to them. It's
No, objects are not red. No.
and and there's no red sitting there in your brain anywhere hiding. It is just the user interface.
Hmm. Yeah. Have to hard disagree on that
Okay.
one.
Well, we can probably go in circles
Yeah.
on this for another hour or two, but we should
Yeah.
probably wrap it up. Final any final? Should we just end it right here? I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe we'll come back and tackle this in a few months or something like this.
Yeah,
See if
we'll
we
keep thinking about
gain
it.
new perspectives. It's a really hard question. That's the problem.
Well, it's not a hard question for me, but
Right, exactly.
it's not a hard problem, is what I meant to say.
Yeah, it's not a hard problem. It's just a bunch of easy problems for you. Yeah.
We'll see what wins out, and maybe we'll just both convert to dualism or a fourth view,
Or just something else that we're just not aware of. Yep.
Well,
and I'm not saying, so to be clear, panpsychism is probably what I would lean towards, but I wouldn't give it like a huge, overwhelming credence.
yeah, I would say maybe that's how we should put how confident we are of each thing. So I would put between these views, and there are dozens of views literally, but
Oh yeah.
but between
Many,
these
many views.
three views, I would put my materialism view at like 70%, 80%.
Mm-hmm.
Dualism at panpsychism at like 10%, and then dualism at like 5%, and then else at the rest.
Right.
I do think panpsychism is more likely than dualism, just because even though it's silly to me, but it doesn't have any blatant contradictions, which I think dualism does.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely attributed that. But of course, I could be wrong about any of them, so they all have some degrees of probability. But where do you kind of sit?
Right. I would put panpsychism as a like maybe 50-50, honestly. So it's like it's pretty close, maybe like 51-49.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit into the more than 50%. I would put materialism as pretty low, maybe 20%, and then just all other possibilities fill up the remaining 30%. Yeah. But like materialism to me seems less and less likely the more I learn physics. It's just it just seems like we don't know what material is.
Well, like I said, materialism. I didn't say this now, but I said it when we were talking about it. I don't love the label materialism because it is like, what is material?
Right. The problem is what we understand material to be has continually changed as we've learned more science.
Right. You definitely have to include information in your material.
And we have no idea what information is. Like that's what information is like the bleeding edge of current scientific inquiry.
Right. Well, I hope you guys have enjoyed us talking in circles for. I'll probably cut some of it because we definitely were just kind of tugging in circles for a while, but thank you guys for sitting through it. Let us know what you think on these views and what you'd like to hear more of in the future. We have some really cool guests and stuff coming up, so stay tuned for that, and we'll see you.
Yep. Until next time.